Hello, my name is Blaise Shepherd, and this is my oral briefing on cultural relativism and the future of international human rights. In this presentation, I am going to go over the historical background of cultural relativism, universalism, and the evolution of the debate between the two. I am also going to go over the current state of the debate between the two, and I'm going to go over a few selected case studies from Asia, Africa, and North America. Finally, I will present my recommendations for the future in the form of U.S. rhetoric and policy proposals. The historical background of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism has its origins in anthropology, with anthropologists like Johann Gottfried Herder in the late 1700s and Franz Boas in the late 1800s to early 1900s. Boas is most often credited with the idea of cultural relativism, but his ideas were a continuation of Herder's rejection of the comparison of cultures. Boas wrote The Mind of the Primitive Man, which argued that individual character is shaped by culture. His idea was that you cannot know an individual without understanding the cultural context in which he comes from. He also argued that cultures are not evolutionistic. This means that cultures do not evolve in a linear fashion, and therefore they are non-comparable. Jack Donnelly, a critic of cultural relativism, describes the spectrum that one can think of in regard to cultural relativism. On one end, there is weak cultural relativism, in which there are many universal human rights and only a few exceptions can be made based on culture. And on the other, there is strong cultural relativism, in which there are only a few universal human rights with a large latitude for interpretation on other human rights based on cultural relativity. Donnelly also argues that the assessment of human rights is not only a quantitative endeavor, but also a qualitative one. An argument for cultural relativism is that human nature is a product of both societal and natural attributes. For example, a preference for a certain type of attribute in a society can lead to a type of natural selection, in which personality types that are not desirable are slowly bred out. Cumulatively, cultural relativism in most argued cases can be understood as an emphasis on the person as a member in a society as opposed to an individualistic understanding. Now for the historical background of universalism. Universalism has its origins in Enlightenment philosophies like those espoused by Immanuel Kant. There is a focus on unalienable rights of men, which can be found in the American and French constitutions. Universalism is a product of the West and has therefore solidified in international relations after World War II by the Western-led order, most notably the United Nations. In its primary human rights doctrine, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, universalism is a leading ideology, evident from its name. As opposed to cultural relativism's focus on the person within a society, universalism emphasizes the individual and their inherent rights as a human being, such as the freedom of expression. Universalism, however, can also be viewed as a spectrum, with strong universalism allowing for few to no exceptions based on culture, and weak universalism allowing for more cultural sensitivity. Other UN covenants, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, are universal in their wording. Still, while they are universal in their wording, there are also allocations for some cultural relativism in the Economic, Social, and Cultural Covenant, which I will discuss shortly. The evolution of the debate. So, as I said before, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is universalistic in its language, in the sense that the rights laid out in the covenant are assumed to apply to all human beings across the globe. However, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights acknowledge cultural relativism in Article 2, Paragraph 3, stating that, quote, developing countries, with due regard to human rights and their national economy, may determine to what extent they would guarantee the economic rights recognized in the present covenant, end quote. In general, the Global North has come to accept universalism in regard to human rights, while the Global South maintains cultural relativism. As such, the debate is centered around the power imbalance between the North and the South, in which the Global North holds the South to standards that they are either unwilling or unable to meet for either social, political, cultural, or economic reasons. The universalistic view of human rights was further cemented in Europe after the Tyrer case of 1978. In this case, the European Court of Human Rights established that despite overwhelming public support and local tradition on the Isle of Man in favor of the death penalty, this is not a justification for a state or government to contradict the European Convention's goal of abolishing the death penalty throughout the continent. Other regional and international organizations also do not allow for governments to avoid compliance to human rights conventions based on local traditions, namely the UN, the American Convention, and the African Charter. All disallow these arguments of cultural relativism. It is important to note, however, that these bodies inherently hold their own form of cultural relativism, but they are seen as universalistic in their respective regions. Since the 1950s onwards, there has been a rebuke of universalism in the argument of decolonization and self-determination, and the idea that universalistic human rights were a new form of imperialism imposed by the West. Cultural relativists even interpreted the 1960 Declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples differently than the authors of the document probably meant it to be interpreted, in the sense that they felt that colonized states are free from external interference, which includes interfering on the grounds of human rights violations. A further embrace by the international community of universalism can be seen in the 1993 Vienna Convention, which established that the universal nature of these rights and freedoms is beyond question, and that all human rights are universal, indivisible, and interdependent and interrelated. However, while embracing universalism, there was also what can be seen as support for cultural relativism in the Vienna Declaration. Quote, "The international community must treat human rights globally in a fair and equal manner, on the same footing, and with the same emphasis. While the significance of national and regional particularities and various historical, cultural, and religious backgrounds must be borne in mind, it is the duty of the states, regardless of their political, economic, and cultural systems, to promote and protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms." End quote. This statement seemingly supports the idea of a culturally sensitive universalism. Finally, establishing a clear evolution from the embrace of cultural relativism to that of universalism are the statements from the American Anthropological Association. Their 1947 statement was supportive of cultural relativism and wary of imposing Western values upon non-Western communities. However, in their 1999 update to this statement, the association distanced themselves from cultural relativism in the context of the debate of human rights, arguing that cultural relativism does not provide justification for the denial of human rights. In their 2020 statement, the American Anthropological Association reinforced this embrace of universalism and questioned what was to be gained by arguing for cultural relativism in the realm of human rights, if not only a deterioration of human rights perpetrated by these non-Western societies. Now for the current state of the debate between cultural relativism and universalism. Universalism has become the mainstream view of human rights application within international organizations such as the UN, mainly at the behest of the West, which is arguably the more influential bloc within international institutions. Developing countries typically emphasize economic freedom and the need for social order in response to human rights critiques by the West. The cultural map that I included in this slide is from a world value survey taken from 2017 to 2020 and published in 2023. The map is based on the distinctions among traditional, secular, and rational values, as well as survival and self-expression. Compared to Western states, non-Western states emphasize tradition and survival, meaning there is less of an emphasis on freedoms like speech and religion, and more of an emphasis on economic and cultural rights. Contemporary critiques lobbied against the Global North's regime of human rights include critiquing international monetary institutions such as the International Monetary Fund. Policies that are in place within the IMF require developing states to cut social spending. Due to these societal spending cuts and the effects that it has on the poor within these states, there are strong feelings that these economic institutions are themselves the greatest defenders of human rights, and therefore the calls for improvements in civil and political rights fall on deaf ears. Additionally, globalization has amplified calls for human rights in both the East and the West. Westerners see the lack of societal development, such as transportation infrastructure, universal health care, and social safety nets, as lapses in their human rights, while Easterners see the lack of individual rights, like that of expression or property, as lapses in their human rights. Generally, it can be understood that the Global South is focused on economic and social rights, while the Global North is focused on civil and political rights. There is also currently a lapse in credibility of the West to enforce human rights due to perceived and actual hypocrisy. Examples of this include condemnation of China's treatment of the Uyghurs compared with the Western war on terror and the treatment of Muslims. Also, Western condemnation of Russia compared with support for Israel. For this case study, I am looking at China and its focus on economic rights versus political rights. Overall, China emphasizes economic and social rights instead of civil and political rights. Traditional Chinese values include the idea that the good of the society is greater than that of the individual. Therefore, promoting economic advancement and lifting their population out of poverty is of greater concern than democratization or freedom of speech. China views critiques against its actions in Tibet and Xinjiang as internal issues outside of the purview of foreign actors. With their prioritization of traditional Chinese values, China also views freedom of expression as a potential disruption of the social order. Again, the emphasis in China is on the society as a whole instead of the individual, therefore justifying repressing rights such as that of speech in favor of maintaining social cohesion. China also views critiques of its human rights violations as hypocritical, citing Western violations such as the continued use of the death penalty in the United States and extrajudicial killings and detainment by police in America. The second case study that I want to look at is Nigeria and its stance on LGBTQ+ rights. The general view of the public is that the emphasis on Western-derived rights, such as gay rights, are a new form of imperialism. The sentiment is that homosexuality is not natural to Nigerian culture and that it is a Western-imposed idea. Nigeria is one of the most anti-gay countries in the world, with multiple laws criminalizing homosexuality, such as the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act of 2014. Even in African states such as South Africa, where gay rights are constitutionally protected, much of the population still does not agree with homosexuality. After the withdrawal of colonial forces from Nigeria, there is an embrace of Sharia law, or aspects of it, including the criminalization of homosexuality. Within Nigerian society, homosexuality is considered as so radical in its deviation from the norm that it passed as perversion. Some gay rights advocates in Nigeria reject the cultural objection to homosexuality on the grounds that both Islam and Christianity largely inform these homophobic views, even as these Oriental religions were never originally part of African culture. Proponents of anti-gay laws claim that these laws are justifiable in a democratic society in the interest of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, or public health. Gay rights advocates also argue that culture is not static, as can be seen by the inclusion of Islam and Christianity into Nigerian society, when both were products of foreign interference. Finally, the last case study that I want to look at is the United States of America. I want to include the United States in the discussion of cultural relativism because while it is often the case that global South countries use cultural relativism in their interest, the West, and specifically the United States, uses this argument in defense of its practices also. An example of this is the American resistance to green energy in favor of traditional energy industries like coal or gas. On the international stage, the United States often uses a rules for thee but not for me mentality. Examples of this can be seen with the U.S. being one of the lead negotiators of the Rome Statute but not ratifying it. Also, you can see the war on terror and the human rights violations perpetrated in Iraq and Afghanistan, human rights violations at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, imposition of civil rights violations against minority groups like Muslims, Arabs, and immigrants, and support for dictatorial regimes like that of Argentina from 1976 to 1983. Some scholars have deemed the American public's refusal to either acknowledge or inform themselves of American human rights violations a culture of denial. This denial of the facts and the repeated occurrence of violations leads to international distrust in the United States to uphold a singular standard of human rights and, more generally, international treaties. The United States also uses the argument of cultural relativism to deny social and economic rights to its citizens due to ideas of American individualism and free market capitalism. While other states prioritize economic rights at the expense of civil rights, the opposite occurs in America. And I want to emphasize that I am not advocating for either method and personally believe that both civil and economic rights should ideally be recognized and achieved, but it is important to note that there are internationally recognized human rights that the US does not adhere to, and it can be argued that this is because of our cultural values. Along with the denial of economic rights, civil rights are also imposed upon subsets of Americans, such as the reaction to Black Lives Matter protesters in 2020 and Native American protesters at Standing Rock in 2016. Claims that these are internal matters that are outside the purview of international actors echoes the rhetoric used by China in regards to its treatment of subsets of its population. And finally, the push against transgender rights can be understood in the context of American, and more specifically Christian, culture, and the idea that it is perverse, echoing rhetoric used by Nigeria in defense of anti-gay legislation. Recommendations for how to manage and, when possible, resolve the challenge posed by cultural relativism for future research. Cultural relativism is currently and will continue to shape future discussions around international human rights standards. As a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and the current global superpower, the United States has a responsibility to adhere to its own standards and regain its global credibility as a human rights defender. There should be domestic support of economic, social, and cultural rights within the United States to have ground to stand on when enforcing other human rights abroad. Given the context that the Global South is more generally concerned with economic, social, and cultural rights, the United States and the West overall should make sure to support states in their aspirations for development. Opposition to civil or political rights violations will fall on deaf ears when the West violates different sets of human rights, or even the same sets, and while the West also inhibits global Southern states from achieving economic development through the Western-led international financial institutions. To manage the issue of cultural relativism, developed states and international monetary institutions such as the IMF must work to achieve greater economic development in the Global South, and Western states must not engage hypocritically with rhetoric calling out the Global South on human rights violations while turning a blind eye to atrocities committed by the West. Improvement in international credibility could be achieved through policy decisions such as U.S. support for reform within international monetary institutions like the IMF and the World Trade Organization that would benefit the Global South and allow for welfare spending by these states. Also, ratification of the Rome Statute and acceptance of International Criminal Court jurisdiction in the United States, along with support for the court both financially and rhetorically. Also taking an initiative on climate change and supporting green energy initiatives and treaties like the Paris Agreement. Also imposing sanctions and other punitive measures against all states engaged in human rights violations, including against Western-backed governments like Israel. And finally, holding individuals and or systems within the U.S. government accountable when human rights violations are committed, like war crimes abroad or domestic police violence and discrimination. Finally, here is the list of sources that I used throughout my presentation and my research. Thank you, everybody.